Okay, I lost my train of thought with the phone call. What was I talking about? I was talking about, oh, so one reason why I think Oscar Wilde and all those people wound up converting to Catholicism, because it's so weird. They were really into this decadent movement. There was this whole, you know, exploring, pushing the limits of sexuality and stuff like that. Why were they why did they all wind up converting to Catholicism? The guy who was the model for Dorian Gray became a priest. I mean, why didn't this happen? And I think it's because they were following that one strain of Romanticism that was this heightened sensation and emotionalism, and really sort of the trouble with that is that it becomes very self-serving, and so basically use it as an excuse. You're being edgy, you're throwing off the reins of this convention, this arbitrary taboos of the Victorian society, and but it's really actually it's quite self-serving. It's just basically you're trying to get away with doing naughty things. And I think that you find that that's miserable, that being that that's selfish, that's self-absorbed, and just doing selfish, destructive things winds up ruining you. And so I think a lot of times they just felt so empty and so despairing. But the other strain is the strain that longs for beauty and goodness and truth, and which is why there was a revival of the medievalism in the Victorian age. I mean, because they sort of longed for that pre-enlightenment. That comes from Joseph Pierce. So I think that's, it was sort of a natural thing. They had chosen this one strain, and it turned out to fail them. And so then they went over to the other side. And so I think that, unfortunately, the Brontes followed the wrong strain in Romanticism. And the reason why I think that is that they weren't consistent in their thought. So they're, they were all daughters of a minister, to a religious man. I don't think it was Church of England, though. I think it was some more severe sect. I'm not sure if he was Church of England. He had a much starker, more puritanical take on things. And that was the atmosphere they were raised in. So and a lot of people consider their novels Christian novels, but there's an inconsistency in especially Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights that is problematic, I think. So, in my head, I call it the moral cop-out. So what they do is they set up, like say in Jane Eyre, okay, you've got Mr. Rochester, and poor Mr. Rochester, he's had this terrible time, he's been tricked into this marriage, and now, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have spoilers in this, so spoiler alert. He's tricked into this marriage, he's miserable because the woman became kind of criminally insane, and he can't, his personality, his temperament can't handle it. So he's miserable. So, and then Jane, he needs Jane, right? So Jane comes along. Jane leaves him. She, collapses on the moor. She's found by John St. John. He's of that puritanical type. She decides she doesn't want him, right? She goes back to the aunt that mistreated her so much in her childhood to get some sort of closure as the aunt's dying. And while she's there, she has this supernatural experience where she hears Mr. Rochester calling her from across the country. And that's supposed to, give us the sense that they were meant to be together. There's some sort of cosmic, supernatural thing going on. And so she decides to go back to him, right? But she's not going to go back. I mean, it's never said in the novel why she's going back to see him. It's pretty obvious if you think of it. She's going back to be his mistress. But since it's never stated, you don't know. And it just conveniently happened. I mean, is she really going to go back and just say, hi, how you doing, just checking in? I don't think so. But conveniently, we have this moral cop-out where things have happened that now he's free, right? And he's been sufficiently punished because he's blind too. And he did this heroic thing, so that makes it better too. And then they wind up, happy ever after. But there was a cop-out because she was going back to him. She was going back to him, even though, it would have been illegal, or it would have been the wrong thing to do. And the same in Wuthering Heights. There's this supernatural element between Heathcliff and Cathy, that they're terrible people. Heathcliff and Cathy are selfish. Heathcliff's a brute, and he's violent, and he's cruel, and Cathy is cruel and vain and weak and selfish. They're not nice people, but it's okay because they have this supernatural connection, and that's why she's calling him and he goes out to her, I mean, it's just a cop-out, because if you have a Christian worldview, which supposedly these writers did, the supernatural either is from God or it's from, the evil one. Which is it? Who's calling you to go, be a mistress to a bigamist, or to a would-be bigamist, right? Or who's calling you, to be together in eternity, when your whole life you've been abusing other people and you're basically being adulterous. It's just, that's not from a good place. So they're using the supernatural as an excuse, as this romantic excuse, like somehow they must have been meant to be together, and it sort of defies good and evil or whatever. But it's not consistent thinking. It's contradictory. And it's like they painted themselves into a corner because they had to have a proper conclusion somehow. But they wanted to push the limits and make it okay that these people are making these choices that are hard, but they're going against, basic Christian teaching. So I just have real problems with the Brontes in that way. And I admit they're wonderful writers. The pacing, the characterization, it's just beautiful writing. But there's just something problematic about it. And also, in Jane Eyre, I do not get Mr. Rochester. I mean, the first time I read it, I was like all swept up in it. But the second time, and the scene that really does it to me is when he dresses up as a gypsy lady and he's questioning Jane Eyre to see how she feels about him. That is so creepy. The Brontes were into these really brutal, dysfunctional, weird men. It's just not my romantic hero. So maybe that's Byron, the Byronic hero or whatever. But Byron, he just strikes me as a creep. So I just don't. And Villette is really anti-Catholic, and it's so crazy because I can't remember her name, but I have only read Villette once. I've read Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights several times. But Villette, she goes over to Belgium, but she doesn't like the Belgians because they're Catholic, and she's above them. And so she has to sort of keep herself from being sullied. And so she isolates herself, and she's always looking down her nose at everybody. And she makes herself so isolated and so judgmental of everybody. I mean, all I could think of when I was reading the book was, what a pill to work with. I mean, and so she almost drives herself insane. Because she's got to keep herself pure. And then she falls in love with this Catholic man. And she goes through all sorts of mental gymnastics to try to get around that one. And I think it was because, the Brontes' father, you couldn't marry a Catholic, right? So falling in love with this Catholic, and then, of course, tragedy in the end because you can't marry a Catholic. So just, Villette was not, and I admit, I read it and really admired the writing while I was reading it, but at the same time, there's just elements in it that are just too questionable for me to be comfortable with the books. Now, I did read Agnes Grey, which is kind of like Villette Light, and is kind of funny, about a girl who goes off to be a governess and dealing with these doting, kind of irresponsible parents and, bratty kids or difficult children. And again, the other thing about the Brontes is they're always saved, or supposedly going to be saved, by romance, by finding the right guy. I don't think that's a very feminist message, frankly. I think Jane Austen is more feminist, actually, than the Brontes. Because it's always like this romantic love is going to solve all the problems. I don't know. So I really have problems with the Brontes. However, I do think they are really fascinating. They're a fascinating family, really tragic, really interesting. And I read Elizabeth Gaskell's The Life of Charlotte Bronte, found it really, really interesting. And so I am kind of, I mean, I have this love-hate relationship. Like Mark Twain said about Jane Austen, that every time he reads her, he wants to dig her up and beat her over the head with her own shin bone. And then, you know, the natural question is, every time you read her, if you dislike her that much, why are you reading her? And that's the way I am with the Brontes. Like, I do read them. I haven't read them all. I haven't read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and I think there's one other maybe that I haven't read. And I haven't really read the Juvenilia, but I do find them really interesting, and I do admire their writing style. And I have a final recommendation, a really fun young adult book that I think was published in the 60s. It's called The Return of the Twelves. You can see that, Return of the Twelves. And it's about the Brontes when they were young. You know, they had these soldiers, these 12 soldiers called the Twelves that they would play with. They didn't have very many playthings. And so they would make up stories about the adventures of the Twelves. And this is a story about a family that moves into their house, and the little boy who finds the Twelves buried like in a box under the floorboards or something. And what happens is a really, really charming young adult story about the Brontes. And if you know about their lives and everything, you really get this book. So I highly recommend this as a light read that really is fun. Anyway, so that's me pontificating on